Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Our topic today is the antinomianism of Frithjof Schuon. I know that's a long word, antinomianism. It's also related to the topics of perennialism and traditionalism. We'll explain all of these as we get into our interview. My guest today is Charles Upton, former beatnik poet and now author of more than 20 books on the traditionalist movement. They include Cracks in the Great Wall, The Science of the Greater Jihad, The System of the Antichrist, Truth and Falsehood in Postmodernism and the New Age, Vectors of the Counter-Initiation, The Course and Destiny of Inverted Spirituality, The Alien Disclosure Deception, The Metaphysics of Social Engineering, and most recently, The Way Forward for Perennialism after the antinomianism of Frithjof Schuon. Charles Upton is based in Lexington, Kentucky, and now I'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, Charles. It's a pleasure to be with you once again.
It's a pleasure to be back from wherever I was.
This is, I don't know, our fifth interview, I think, at this point. We're going to look a lot more deeply into some of the questions we've already touched upon, the nature of traditionalism, the nature of perennialism, and in particular, a person who was at one time your primary teacher, Frithjof Schuon.
Yeah, my primary teacher on the philosophical level, you might say, he was never my Sufi sheikh, so he wasn't a teacher in that sense. But in terms of my intellectual life, he probably had more influence on me than any other single writer, and I'm very grateful for that influence. I mean, it, like as they say, changed my life.
When I did a Google search on Frithjof Schuon, because he was not a figure I'm familiar with, I was surprised to discover something like 300,000 entries. He's very clearly an important intellectual figure, but I know that many of our viewers will not have heard of him, will not even be familiar with the traditionalist movement that you and I have talked about now so many times.
Yeah, I'm sure that's true, because the traditionalist movement, there was an ambiguity there. I mean, it styled itself as something, for the few and the elevated, for the spiritual intellectuals. And yet there was a great desire for those ideas to get beyond that small circle. So there was a tension back and forth there. Well, I mean, Frithjof Schuon at one point was certainly the sheikh, which is the Sufi term for pretty much guru of Huston Smith. So, he was strictly a follower of Schuon for some years. So anyway, well, the traditionalists are said to have been founded by René Guénon, who was a French metaphysician who died, I think, in 1950, 51, something like that. And the other major influence on the development of the traditionalist school was Ananda Kentish Kumaraswamy, who was well-known at one point Anglo-Indian from Sri Lanka who wrote on traditional art and finally moved on metaphysics and did some wonderful books. So, and René Guénon's career, if we can do it quickly, he was a Catholic, as people were in France in his time, early in the 20th century. But at the same time, he looked at Catholicism and he says, I think there's something missing here. There's an esoteric dimension that isn't, is no longer in evidence. So he searched every esoteric and occult group available in his time, and went quite far in some of them. It was the neo-Gnostics and the Martionists and the Theosophists, and the list is very long. And he came out of that period of investigation saying, look, what's going on in this world of let's call it vaguely occultism, is not just useless, it's dangerous. Bad stuff is, dangerous stuff is going on there. He saw the beginnings, I think, of the kind of Satanism we're seeing come out of the closet now. And, but then his studies at one point, or progressively, shifted toward looking at the major world religions and what was the esoteric center of the major world religions. If you go as far into, but it's pretty much on the surface in Buddhism. In Islam, you have to go, into the world of Sufism to find it. In Christianity, unfortunately, he didn't know much about hesychasm, which is Eastern Orthodox contemplative spirituality, a formal path, which is in form very much like Sufism, actually. He unfortunately didn't know a lot about that. It's like, as I will have to say also about Huston Smith, he was great speaking about all the other religions, but when he was speaking about the religion in which he was raised, which was Christianity, well, you assume, well, of course I know about that. I was raised in that, but not necessarily. That's the one he understood perhaps least, and so there was a little bit of that in Guénon. He dialogued or attempted to dialogue with Jacques Maritain, the well-known neo-Thomist Catholic writer, and but finally he determined that and what he wanted to do is actually find something like a Christian Sufism within Freemasonry, and he said, perhaps Freemasonry could be the esoteric center of Christianity that he felt was missing. And he tried his level best most of his life to come up with something in that regard and didn't really succeed. He wrote for both Freemasonic and anti-Freemasonic journals trying to create what he needed. And so finally he said, well, I need a spiritual path that's legitimate, so I'm going to become a Muslim. And he took Sufi initiation, and he moved to Egypt and lived in Egypt for the rest of his life as a traditional Muslim. So that's pretty much his. But he was a major intellectual force in France. When he died, even after he'd moved to Egypt, all the radios came on and said, "We have sad news. René Guénon has passed away. Let's have a moment of silence for the great philosopher." So he had that position. But in one way of looking at it, his major successor, and there's other ways of looking at it, his major successor was Fritjof Schuon. They had disagreements. Schuon wanted the mantle of Guénon. Guénon didn't quite want to give it, but that's a complex area we don't need to get into. But Schuon, when it came to Christianity, he came along and said, look, Christianity is not lost its esoteric dimension. The esoteric aspect of Christianity is the sacramental order. The sacraments are esoteric Christianity, and the three levels of initiation are baptism, confirmation, or which is called chrismation in Eastern Orthodox Christianity, and the Eucharist. Those correspond to the three classic levels of the mystical path, which are purgation, illumination, and union. So this is what he said. Later on, he had problems with Christianity. He was not consistent in a lot of ways, but he was right. He was righter about Christianity than Guénon, as far as I'm concerned. Whereas Guénon was the guy you have to turn to learn about the counter initiation and what counterfeit spirituality is, and what subversive spirituality is, because he explored those areas very deeply. And in fact, he said, I'm not fit to be a spiritual master because my soul has been damaged through my years with occultism and, and getting into magical conflicts with the forces of evil and all of this. And he said, I survived, but I did not survive intact in the way that I could really guide anyone else. So that was, whereas Schuon certainly believed he could guide people. And so he became, through some method or other, a sheikh of the Shadali Darqawi Alawi lineage. And there's controversy about whether he was ever really appointed sheikh or whether he appointed himself. And this is a whole other story. So, but what perennialism, you can talk about tradition. This is the traditionalist school and the other writers in that school. I mean, Schuon was able to bring together an amazing group of people, including Titus Burckhardt, Martin Lings, Sayed Hossein Nasser, who's still with us, and Houston Smith at one point, and Whittle Perry and Marco Pallas. It's just a list of amazing spiritual luminaries that he was able to bring together. So as an intellectual influence, that he elevated the entire discourse on comparative metaphysics and comparative religion to a higher level than anyone has seen. And it was such a high level that it's very hard to see the contradictions, which they are few, but they are very, very, serious within his writings. So Fritjof Schuon, and he started out with leading a Sufi circle in Switzerland, and then he moved to the United States, to Indiana, to Bloomington, Indiana. And basically, he created a scene in Bloomington, Indiana, which was under the umbrella of a supposedly a Sufi order, but it did not follow either traditional Muslim norms or traditional Sufi norms. For example, nude dancing was one of the major features of it, which might have been very nice and it might have been helpful to some people. Who knows? Although one must be suspicious, as I am, but I'm not going to judge. I'm going to say, who knows why people do things and what they're called to do and what they need spiritually at a particular time. Who knows? It's not for me to judge, but you can clearly judge and say, this is not allowed by any a school of the Muslim Sharia, and so he had a tendency to claim that he was entirely orthodox and in line with the Sharia, because orthodoxy was very big in his writing. We're looking for the orthodox spirituality, not heterodox occultism and stuff like that. And yet, what he did was not orthodox, and here you can simply say, well, here's the law as it's written down, and here's what he did, and they don't connect. So, if I have a problem with Schuon, I would not, judge him in terms of sexual morality. He had 4 wives, some of, at least 2 of which, 2 or 3, I forget, were married to other men for a while he claimed them as wives. And this doesn't go along with the Sharia either. But, I don't judge him in terms of sexual morality, because how do I know? I don't know his intent. I don't know his soul. Now, this is a big thing in Islam and Sufism. You say, may God keep his secret. You do not judge another person's, relationship with God. That there's a phrase which is very common in Islam. They say, may God keep his secret. So may God keep his secret, and I don't need to know it. Also, an important principle in Islam is acts are judged by their intent. So I don't know his intent. I can't, On the other hand, when he claims to be doing something and he's actually doing something else, then you can compare and you can say, well, these don't add up, So the element of dishonesty is more concerning to me than the element of sexual morality, which perhaps should be concerning to me, but I don't want to go there because, None of us are perfect in that regard. So, but in any case, I want to say, I think everybody who is interested in metaphysics, comparative religion, and who really needs an intellectual approach to spirituality, not everybody does. And I don't think the intellectuals are the higher spiritual caste. We're the intellectuals. Schuon would tend to say, we're the intellectuals, we're the higher caste. I don't say that. I'm just saying some people need that. If you don't have a rigorous intellectual understanding of your faith, you can't maintain your faith. So for those people who need it, Frithjof Schuon will elevate your level of understanding of metaphysics and comparative religion to a higher level than you've conceived of before. It's amazing what his books can do. So I would suggest that anybody who is interested in these things read everything he ever wrote. Just don't read looking for something to believe in. Read understanding that there are controversies about him, and that the controversies, but you will not be able to understand his contradictions or his errors, if errors they are, until you assimilate his perspective. He has to teach you how to criticize him. Otherwise, you will be clueless. And I have found anyway that assimilating his luminous doctrines and then realizing, and yet, this is a contradiction here, isn't it? And things like this, and you look at his actions and you say, well, so there are two courses of Frithjof Schuon. The first is the course of, the neophyte who says, I just want to learn what this great man knows. And then the next course is saying, now that I've learned that, maybe a critique of Frithjof Schuon, respectful and yet uncompromising when necessary, can really be the next phase of what we learn from the works of this man. Because, that my period of doing, a critique of Frithjof Schuon was as important to me as the time when I just, imbibed him. So I go out and buy all his books, and then then you can get back to me, and say, tell me how they affected you, because he was definitely, an unparalleled spiritual genius. And, like geniuses, particularly artistic geniuses, they will have a dark side, right? So.
Well, in your recent book, in the subtitle, you refer to the antinomianism of Frithjof Schuon. Let's define that word for our viewers. I think many people are puzzled by what such a large word really means.
Yeah, well, antinomianism, it comes from nomos, which I think is related to the word for name, but it means law. And antinomianism is the idea that there are those of the elect, of the chosen, who form a higher spiritual caste, and the law is not applicable to them, whether it be the Muslim Sharia or laws of morality or whatever, considered to be human laws are not applicable to them because they are beyond good and evil, as we've heard that phrase a lot. And some of the Gnostics of late antiquity were antinomians in that sense. Some of the Gnostics were strict ascetics, more strict than the Orthodox Christians. They would starve themselves to death. Other of the Gnostics were antinomians in the sense that they said, commit sins because this world has been created by the false demiurge, and the way to oppose him is through opposing these moral rules that he's laid down. And this is a very common attitude that you get in religious streams that end up being considered heterodox in terms of a major tradition. This happens a lot. It's like the crazy wisdom guru. Can do crazy things, but he's Gurdjieff obviously was pretty antinomian. So anyway, but what is the theory of why someone who's of the elect can ignore the law? Well, theory might go like this. It is a true metaphysical principle that I believe that the intellect is higher than the will. The intellect, in the higher sense of the intellect, means the ability, the faculty that looks upon truth directly with the eye of the heart, just like the eye sees light, the eye of the heart sees truth. And this is what in Thomas Aquinas in scholastic Thomism is called intellectus in Latin, whereas the lower level of what we call intellectual is ratio, which is the rational mind. There's the direct perception of truth, and then the rational mind takes what the direct perception of truth sees and draws conclusions from it and argues on the basis of it like this. So the idea, okay, that the intellect has to be higher than the will, because without the intellect, the will not know what to will. And the strength of the will, the power of the will, is certainty. So if the will conforms itself to what the intellect in the higher sense knows with absolute certainty, because it's seeing it right before its heart eye, right now, it sees it, it knows it. And if the will follows that kind of certainty, it has great power because it's not divided. It doesn't say, well, maybe it's this or maybe I should do this. Whereas if the will does not follow the intellect in that sense, it's going to have to follow something to figure out what to will. And what's it going to follow? The various impulses, which, we call the passions, will pop up and says, why don't you follow, making money? Why don't you follow, indulging all the lusts you can possibly imagine? Or why don't you follow, getting even? Follow. In other words, these various passions will come up, and call to the will to follow them. And when this happens, the will become drained and become divided and not know what to do. So this is why the will must, if it's going to fulfill its function, it must follow the intellect. It must follow intellectual certainty. And so since the intellect is higher than the will is the servant of the intellect. The will submits to the intellect and thereby finds its true grounding and its true value, its true purpose. Okay, that's the way it goes. But this can be misinterpreted. And the way it can be misinterpreted is it's possible to say, well, since the intellect is higher than the will, I identify with the intellect. I am the intellectual man. I am the Gnostic, and these other people who don't understand what I understand, who the eye of their heart is not open, they follow the will. These are the voluntarists or the passional men who follow the will. And so they're the ones who have to be under the law because they're full of passions and they need to be reined in by the law, whereas I'm beyond that because I am the intellectual man. As if the intellectual man does not even have a will, which is not true. The will doesn't disappear just because, you have understood intellectual things that are higher than the will. The will is there, and it has to be conformed to what the intellect teaches it. But it's possible to say, well, all of that is for the lower men. I don't have to. I can do whatever I want. Is what it finally comes down to. And I can do whatever I want is not really a very Gnostic or intelligent thing to say, because we know what happens when people who take that attitude. At one point, it causes problems. So anyway, that's how antinomianism grows up. As my wife Jenny pointed out yesterday, there's a third possibility. It is possible that the one whose heart eye is open, will see situations, and of course will see situations in a much different and more comprehensive way than someone who does not have that faculty of spiritual intelligence open. And so that person may end up doing things that look to people who are entirely involved in following the law as a crazy thing that is very destructive. Why did you do that? And this is allowed for in the Quran itself, in the Surah of the Cave, and the story of Moses and Khizr, which is a very famous story in Sufism. And Khizr is the immortal prophet, also known as the Green Man, who is the patron of the Sufis. Now, the Quran does not use that name, but the story is that Moses encounters a mysterious master. And Moses recognizes that this master knows more than he does and says, all right, I want to follow you as my guide. And the mysterious master says, well, I don't think you'll be able to do it. You will not be able to stand me. I will freak you out so bad that you will not be able to stay with me. And Moses says, oh, no. I want to learn. I want to know more than anything, so I'll stay with you. So they go on this journey, and the mysterious master ends up committing these crimes or doing these crazy things. In one place, he gets to a place where there's some fishermen and their boats are tied up, and he just busts a hole in the bottom of one of the boats so it sinks, and then I think several of the boats. Or another point, he comes and there's a young man who seems to be doing no harm, and he just kills him. And Moses says, wait a minute, I can't follow this anymore. I'm Moses, and I came up with the 10 commandments of what you're supposed to do. Thou shalt not kill. I can't go along with this. And the master says, who is identified by the Sufis with Khizr, it's hard to pronounce that word, says, well, I told you couldn't stand my actions. But now, since our time together is an end, I'll tell you what was going on. I knew that there were some pirates who were going to come and steal all those fishing boats. So I sank them to put them out of the reach of the pirates. And when the tide goes out, the fishermen will be able to recover the boats and patch them up, and they will have them. So I saved the fishermen from having their boats stolen. And as for the young man, he was just about to kill both of his parents. And so, I stopped this crime. So this is to say that there are higher moralities that can't simply fall under a codified law because they have to do with subtle situations or with knowledge that is not common. So this is a possibility. On the other hand, if somebody says, I'm following the Sharia and then isn't, then that's not quite the same situation. So that's a possibility too. But every spiritual teacher who wants to do whatever he wants will, if he knows about that story, he'll invoke that story. Well, you see, the reason Rajneesh did all this stuff was because he had a higher knowledge, and so we've sort of learned to not trust that excuse, and yet it's still possible, So we have to admit the possibility. So.
Well, let's come back for a moment to the philosophy of traditionalism or perennialism. I'm trying to understand it, and one of the terms that I notice in your writings and the writings of others is the use of the term metaphysics to imply that there's some certainty around metaphysics. Because I think in traditional academic philosophy, metaphysics is usually regarded as, well, we have no way to resolve the disputes between different metaphysical approaches. But I'm under the impression that traditionalists feel differently, that you do have a way that metaphysics begins with God.
Yeah, it begins with God. And in terms of, and of course, the word metaphysics is used in academia sometimes to mean just the basic assumptions upon which any way of thinking is based? Well, the metaphysics of this worldview is X. Whether it's what traditionalists would call metaphysics at all, it's just, let's just say that there are certain doctrines, metaphysical or mystical doctrines, which are truly identical across very different traditions. Now, in Hinduism, and the Vedantic Hinduism, you have a conception of Saguna Brahman and Nirguna Brahman. Brahman is the absolute reality. Saguna Brahman is the absolute reality with attributes. We say, let's use the word God. We say God is all wise, all loving, all knowing, all powerful. And then there's Nirguna Brahman, which is Brahman without attributes, which is, beyond form and beyond explanation in terms of form. Now, this is strictly the same, I would say, as in Sufism. You have Allah, who would correspond to Saguna Brahman. Allah, the synthesis of all the names of God is Allah. And then, as opposed to Al-Zat, Al-Dhat, which is the word for the unknowable divine essence. So Al-Zat and Allah are the same as Nirguna Brahman and Saguna Brahman. In Christianity, the terms are God for Saguna Brahman, Godhead for Nirguna Brahman. And you would say in Kabbalah, for example, perhaps the tree of the Sephiroth, the tree of life, together would constitute Saguna Brahman, whereas the Ein Sof would be Nirguna Brahman. So you have this, and these doctrines are strictly equivalent. I'm sorry, they're just the same thing with different names. Whereas there's so many elements, necessary elements in the different traditions, which are different and irreconcilable. Like, in Islam, God is one. God is, God forbid that we should say that he should take to himself a son, and God is purely one, and there is no son of God, and so in Christianity does not go along with that. There is a son of God who is of one essence with the Father. So these are irreconcilable, although in my book I go a little, maybe this is not quite kosher, but I go a little farther toward reconciling them than maybe anybody would consider to be legitimate, but I did my best. But yet, and then I get to the point and I say, well, but really they can't be reconciled. The Muslims must start and pursue their spiritual life from the standpoint of the absolute unity of God, whereas Christians must pursue their spiritual lives from the standpoint of the Trinity of God, which is also unity. God, it's not three gods, but yet Trinitarianism. Now, there is a Trinitarianism in Islam, but you find it in Ibn Arabi, and it's not quite the same as the Christian Trinitarianism. And so it's, one could say this: if God is strictly one, perfectly one, and if, as the Sufis say, God is truly the only being, then God must be God as he is in himself, beyond our knowledge. That would be the Father. God, he must be God within, as the center of the human form, the center of the human heart, the essence of the human being, because he's the essence of everything. He's the essence of the human being, and the human being is the synthesis of all the names of God. So that's God the Son. And then he must be the power that is behind all manifestation in the universe. The essence of everything and the power that flows through everything. This is God the Holy Spirit. Okay, you can do that, but it's not going to be efficacious to say, well, I see, it's all, didn't Bede Griffith say something like that? It's all the same doctrine. It's not all the same doctrine. You have to really respect the integrity and the uniqueness of the doctrine that you yourself are following, or will not do you the slightest good. So, there's almost a tension between seeing the similarities and in some cases the identities of doctrines between the different traditions and saying, but look, you can't amalgamate these traditions without creating a mishmash that will essentially deconstruct all of them. Because you have a tendency in interfaith movement to soft pedal doctrines that will offend the other religions, and so all the religions deny their most characteristic doctrines in order to try to befriend each other, and this is unfortunate because everybody loses when that's done.
So you see a real difference between the ecumenical movement and the perennialist movement.
Well, yeah, I do. I think the perennialist movement, and I should say perennialism is a more general term than the traditionalist school. It's associated also in some people's minds with Aldous Huxley and Gerald Heard, who also did some work in looking at similar doctrines between different traditions. So perennialism, let me just quickly say, perennialism, to define it, is the belief that the truth of God to humanity and the universe has always been known by the human race perennially from day one, and has been transmitted through the generations, through perhaps millions of years, sometimes openly in a way that everybody could believe, and sometimes clandestinely through small groups of initiates, but in any way it's been transmitted and it's always been known. And what it includes is the knowledge that even though all the religions primordially in the ancient past spring from the primordial revelation, which is the revelation of the human form itself on earth, this is why the Muslims say that Adam was the first prophet. At the same time, when the tree of religion branched, it branched into various revealed religions. And so you can say that God has sent more than one religion with his seal of approval in order to give the human race a path back to union with him. And so there's not just one true religion, and actually some of these religions may even be operative spiritually at the same time. So you accept that. That's what you accept from the perennialist standpoint. That is, that could be agreed with by the ecumenical movement or the interfaith movement. But that's almost all that can be agreed, because the perennialists at their best will say, and the orthodoxy of each one of these traditions is the essence of it, and that is the essence of the path of the people following that religion. It's not saying we have one big group, we take a little bit from here, a little bit from there, and we see the unities, and maybe we can have one big religion and nobody will fight anymore. That didn't work out with globalism, did it? We had one big global system, and now, because we have the war in Ukraine, everything is going to hell at once, because we had this global unity, which was established up to a point but could not be maintained. And so now we see how that's not the best idea.
Yeah, in your writings, you seem to suggest that one of the enemies of traditionalism or perennialism is, I think, what you refer to as global elitism. And another one of I think you would describe this as an enemy, is postmodernism.
Yeah, well, postmodernism accepts, and this is what you'll find in academia now. If perennialism is losing influence in academia, it's because we're now, the postmodernists have taken over the academies, and for them, the particular distinctions between ideas, between folklore, between doctrines, between religions and religious practices are the foreground. And the supposed unity of all these things is simply, to many postmodernists, an illusion. So it turns perennialism on its head. And, this is good because there was a tendency, which you would see in what I call promiscuous liberal ecumenism of soft peddling all the differences. And this was destructive to the religions. But to say all the differences are absolute means, and when you add to that, each religion believes it's the only true religion, this is the recipe for universal war, right? So, there needs to be at least a theory of perennialism that does not fall into either of those problems of weakening all the religions by saying there are no real differences between them, or absolutizing the differences and calling for total conflict. So this is why I think perennialism, the right kind of perennialism, is very important in the world today. Now, when it comes to what Alexander Dugin, who it seems to be true, emerging as true, that he is or has been Putin's brain, because a lot of what Putin is saying now comes right out of Dugin's books. The destruction of the unipolar world. That's Dugin's rhetoric right there. And what Dugin is very much a postmodernist. Now, his idea, of how to impose postmodernism politically, is he says, well, we'll support every religion, every possible modulation of belief in anything remotely resembling religion, as long as it has an ethno-religious group that believes that. We will say we support your distinction, we support your separateness, we support your tradition. And so if Dugin had his way, there would be a large Russian empire which would allow every shade of religious belief, to have its own community and its own, internal autonomy and like this, but they would be absolutely separated from each other. Because he doesn't believe in unity, because he's a postmodernist. The only unity that a postmodernist believes in is a unity of power. I remember Huston Smith said that in a lecture once. He says, if the unity of truth is denied, which is a major doctrine of scholastic philosophy and of perennialism, that ultimately the truth is one. Ultimately, God is one. If the unity of truth is denied, we will have no recourse but to create unity based only on power, and that's what Dugin wants. It's a little bit like the way the Ottoman Empire was set up with something called millets, which are semi-autonomous ethno-religious communities, which have their own. The Christians have their own patriarch, and this other people have this. And there would be a great deal of freedom and autonomy within those traditions, within those communities, as long as they didn't step outside the bounds. I mean, it's every religion to its own ghetto. Not only that, but the actual leaders would be appointed by the imperial state. Which was certainly true under the Soviets when it came to Eastern Orthodoxy and probably the other religions. Right now, as far as I know, the religions that are established under the Russian Constitution are Eastern Orthodox Christianity, not Catholicism. That's for Poles, and not evangelical Christianity, but Eastern Orthodox Christianity, Buddhism, Islam, and shamanism. So those are established, but nobody's supposed to proselytize. Don't go out and spread the doctrine, because that's considered to be a kind of, invasion of a neighboring state. Don't do that. Stay within your ghetto. And it's, strangely enough, the other place I ran into this attitude, this proposal almost, was in the United Religions Initiative, which is the most liberal, omni-tolerant religious movement that ever existed. And yet, since it accepted all the religions, it had to say, but no religion is to proselytize another. This was beginning to be talked about in that world. So anyway, this is Dugin's idea of what would you say, ecumenism or of a multi-religious empire is entirely postmodern. It's postmodernism turned into a political imperative. So what I'm saying is that my idea of perennialism, which I more or less got from Fritjof Schumann, my problem is he didn't follow his own ideas in some cases. And in some cases, he said other things which contradicted them seriously, you know. But nonetheless, I learned it mostly from him, is to say that we have to accept not just the uniqueness, but the autonomy of the major world religions, of the revealed religions, and not try to amalgamate them into one shapeless mishmash, not absolutize them to the point where they all must fight each other, which is what actually, you want to talk about the global elites. The idea of a shapeless religious unity where all the doctrines of the religions are soft-pedaled and eroded, that's more or less what the global elites want to do domestically. And by domestically, I mean in Europe, Western Europe and North America. What they do outside of that framework with what I would call the remnant of neo-colonialism is they weaken the religions in another way, which is by exacerbating conflict between them. I remember when our Muslim peace movement, the Covenants Initiative, made its debut here in Lexington, Kentucky. I was at the Bilal Mosque with our director, Dr. John Andrew Morrow, and I was talking about the tendency of the global elites to weaken the religious, the autonomy of the various religions by causing conflict between them. And there's someone who spoke up, and he must have been from Pakistan because he had the accent of the Indian subcontinent. He said, yes, you know, I understand what you're saying, because in my hometown, you know, in Pakistan, presumably, there would be nights when persons unknown would throw slaughtered cows into Hindu temples and slaughtered pigs into mosques, you know. And then when the sun came up, it was a virtual certainty that there would be Hindu-Muslim riots the next day. No one thought that there was somebody else out there trying to create the Hindu-Muslim riots who could not have been either a Hindu or a Muslim, but must have been operating, you know, on some other, with some other imperative, with some other direction. So, you know, there is this tendency to create deliberate conflicts between the religions to weaken them. That's what the globalist elites do outside of their domestic framework, which is Western Europe and North America. So this is why I consider the perennialism, as I understand it, which I learned mostly from Schumann, is going to prevent promiscuous liberal ecumenism, which is one problem, conflict between absolutized religious doctrines, you know, which are mutually exclusive and have to fight. That's another problem. Or Dugin's idea of creating an empire where every religious shade of belief gets its own ghetto, but they mustn't relate to each other and they mustn't proselytize each other. All of these are the destruction of religion. So that's why perennialism is important in a world like this. And the other thing is, according to postmodernism, religious beliefs don't have any objective reference. They're not talking about anything real in the spiritual world. They're just they are the way a particular group that identifies with a particular religion, and it's often an ethnic group, the way a particular group will talk about itself, will understand itself, will attempt to understand itself through these doctrines. So the doctrines are entirely self-referential to the group. They don't refer to anything beyond the group. In other words, they don't refer to any God. We're not talking about God. We're just talking about the way groups see each other. We're talking about collective psychology of this group or that. So if that's all religious doctrine is, this is essentially atheism, because there is no objective referent. There's no God. There's just, these are our totems. These are our gang colors, man, and that's all there is to religion. That's how destructive postmodernism is to true religion. So perennialism of the right kind can stand against that tendency as well.
Well, one of the other problems you've raised is in pointing out that traditionally, according to traditionalist metaphysics, we live in a very dark age. The Kali Yuga, one of my friends refers to it as the dark age of scientism. I think you probably would agree with that.
Nothing to add to that. Scientism is one of the problems. Yeah. Psychologism, and now we have the age of universal ideological fanaticism, where to the degree that we don't believe in God, we have to believe in something. So we adopt an ideology and are willing to kill and die for that ideology, no matter how narrow it may be. That's me, that's us, that's what we believe in. And this comes from an erosion of sort of the almost instinctive belief in the reality of God that was in Western civilization, even if people were not super church-going Christians or super synagogue-going Jews. There was the sense, the man upstairs. You feel the reality, the common reality of the spiritual world, and that reality, that instinct is getting eroded. So people develop idols because you have to worship something. Like Bob Dylan said, you got to serve somebody, and since they're not serving the Lord, they're serving one kind of devil or another.
Well, you point out that in this dark age, we have the internet. All of the religions are pretty much online, at least thousands of them, and it's evident to everybody that these doctrines are incompatible with each other. So the idea that there's a general malaise or disillusionment of religion in general, or the idea of God, is rather pervasive in our culture today, making it unique.
It just came out that 10% fewer people than a few years ago now believe in God in the United States. Yeah. And well, yeah, I mean, this is the problem, because all the religious doctrines are known. The religions are thrown up against each other culturally through immigration and whatever else. We need a sense that there's a reason for the difference in the doctrines, and yet the ultimate reality we're all talking about is the same. That's without that, people will say, well, if both of these religions say their absolute truth, and if they say different things, well, to hell with this. I don't need to be jerked around by this craziness. I don't need to believe any of this stuff. Forget it. And then people either become atheists or they, become spiritual but not religious. Which is something that's actually part and parcel of this new interest in near-death experiences, which people are having because of advances in medical science that can be brought back to life after going much farther into the death process than ever was possible before. But now they say, well, I saw the truth directly. Some people come back and it confirms their religion. Other people come back and say, I saw that God doesn't care about religion, because I saw the truth itself, naked, not through all this religious doctrine, Well, I understand. I have a certain sympathy for that reaction, and yet they probably don't know their religious doctrine very well. No, but the depths of the religious doctrines of Islam, Christianity, and other religions, I'm thinking particularly of Islam and Christianity, are not being taught very well at all these days. There are plenty of Muslims running around this country who say they're Muslims because they're Arabs. And that's what they think Muslim means. Oh, I don't go to mosque or anything, but I'm a Muslim because, my name is Ali. That's right. And there's a general kind of Christianity which really has no appreciable theology to it, but it's a belief in, if all you have to do is accept Jesus as your personal savior once, in a moment of faith, and you think that constitutes a complete spiritual life, you're going to be disappointed somewhere down the line. There's more to religion than that.
We started by talking about antinomianism, the idea that there's something about the authenticity of the individual that transcends the rules of a group. And Fritjof Schuon seemed to embody that to some extent.
That's a little different question, really, because antinomianism, as I use it, which is generally a pejorative term, a negative term, is it's a pretension. I am of a higher spiritual caste. Not I'm an individual and I'm not reducible to any tradition because I am myself and like everybody else is themselves. That's one thing. The antinomianism that says because I understand these things, I am of a higher caste and the law doesn't apply to me. That's a pretension. Whereas the thing of the individual is irreducible. The Sufis say there are many spiritual paths as there are human souls, and the Hindus talk about this, your swadharma, your own particular spiritual truth and spiritual way. And for a traditionalist, the challenge is to make a synthesis between that individual way and a larger tradition with all the resources and the understanding and the grace that is in that tradition. The thing is, I often say, Nietzsche challenged people to go their own individual way and almost, create their own myth or something like this. Or some of the Jungians talking about create our own myth. Well, that's a big job to create your own myth. Not everybody can do that. And it ends up too often to be just a myth of me, which is fine, but, or maybe it's not so fine. Is it just another kind of narcissism? I don't know. But the thing is, you can't just say, well, whatever I am doesn't count. I used to be an individualist, but now I'm going to go over and believe in this tradition and pour myself blindly into the mold of this tradition and take on the form of this tradition. And if I'm an American Muslim, I'm going to grow a beard. This beard started out as a hippie beard. So Islam inherited this beard, right? But I didn't grow it for the purpose of Islam. So I'll grow a beard and I'll wear a little white hat and I'll speak with my finger pointing upwards, and this doesn't work. You have to you have to know yourself insofar as that's possible and bring the totality of who you are to the tradition that is calling you. And there's going to be a tension between that tradition and your individuality. And that tension can be very fruitful if you know how to play it and you have patience and stamina and you don't despair when the contradictions seem too intense, because the religions are great storehouses of grace and wisdom, which it would be a disaster if we lose them and can no longer avail ourselves of them.
Well, Fritjof Schuon, if I understand correctly, at one point wrote, and other traditionalists agree, if you're on a spiritual path, it needs to be one of religious orthodoxy. Well,
that's what he said, but is that what he did? That's one of the questions. But yeah, that is what he said. And in broad terms, and I mean, and this was said even more explicitly by Titus Burckhardt. There was some letter he wrote to a seeker, and he said, the thing is, salvation is only to be found within, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, and you can't just join Hinduism because you have to be born into one of the castes, one of the varnas. And it would be true of Taoism, but Taoism is lost, since communist China, or you can't find it anymore. And of course, in broad terms, I think that's pretty good advice. But then Fritjof Schuon would always say, and yet the Spirit bloweth where it listeth. The Spirit can light anywhere on anything and on anyone. That's true too. You cannot look at someone and say, since you are outside of these great religious frameworks, then, well, you're lost. I'm sorry. You can't do that, because we don't know what God has planned for us and what he has given to someone else. We don't know. So you have to say, it's like generally good advice to say, follow the major religions, but get to their depths if you can. But that's a generality. It's a necessary generality, but that's not the whole story.
I have spoken to people who have a mystical inclination, who have been involved in the ecumenical movements, for example, dialogues between Christians and Muslims. And what I hear from them consistently is that the mystics, those who are into the esoteric traditions of whatever culture, have more in common with each other than the orthodox of each tradition.
This is true. I just wouldn't make a distinction between the mystics and the orthodox, because orthodoxy is certainly there's nothing more orthodox than mysticism, as long as you don't use it to create a heterodox doctrine, which is something else. But the mystical centers of the different traditions are a lot closer to each other than the minutiae of the Torah or the Sharia, or of different practices and different things. When the language of the mystics tends to be almost, to get toward a kind of unanimity. What I say is, though, the major doctrine of the traditionalist school, if you can say there's a major doctrine, is called the transcendent unity of religions. Now, we can understand what the unity of religions is because promiscuous liberal ecumenism can say, well, let's let all the religions come together in dialogue and create a greater unity, and then there will be no conflict, which didn't turn out to be true. But what does it mean it's a transcendent unity? What's interesting is the doctrines of the different religions come closer and closer together. The more you get to what the mystics are saying, the more you get to the mystical centers of the doctrines. I mean, Meister Eckhart can say things that could have come from Ibn Arabi or from the Vedanta. This is true. You get closer; they get closer and closer. But the interesting thing is, they never become completely unified. They never become completely unanimous. There's always a subtle difference in perspective. And what this proves is that the unity of the religions is truly transcendent. The religions are united in God, in the mystery of God. They're not united in somebody's idea of here's the universal theology we can draw from all the different beliefs. They're united only in God. So I think that the fact that the doctrines become closer together, the closer you get to the mystical centers of the religion, but they never completely meet in the world of form, is another way of expressing or proving the validity of the transcendent unity of religions, not the worldly unity of religions, the transcendent.
Well, I kind of think that the same principle would apply to the individual, that is self-consistency. You've criticized Schuon for not being consistent with what he himself has said, but in a way that's true of every human being.
Yeah, I mean, or every human being is going to be confronted with apparently necessary inconsistencies that this doesn't absolve us from trying to reach the consistency, right? And yet, yeah, I mean, the spiritual life and life in itself is complex and filled with contradictions, and the struggle with those contradictions in the name of a unity that we intuit but may not be able to express on all levels of our being is a big part of the spiritual life in itself. The contradictions are the fuel that if we don't lose our faith will, energize us in the spiritual life to come closer to unity if we can.
Well, I think that's a very important point and a good point to close our discussion on today, Charles.
Okay, let me just make one announcement. My publisher, James Whitmore, who published my book, which I am selling now, it is available. It's called The Way Forward for Perennialism, after the antinomianism of Fritjof Schuon, and in which I have great praise for Fritjof Schuon, and also point out some places where I don't think he, if he was alive, I would ask him, "What did you mean here?" So now we just have to ask his followers. But anyway, Whitmore has defined my book as something in what he calls the Dialogos series, where he imagines that some people will disagree with things I've said in that book, because the people who follow Fritjof Schuon's, who are in his Sufi Tarika and who follow his doctrines to the letter, tend to be very vociferous in defending him on many levels and defending his doctrines. And this is what we hope will happen. This is what we encourage. It would be wonderful. It would be fruitful if people could come forward and say, "Well, I think Upton is full of you-know-what because, he said this about Schuon, and no, Schuon, he doesn't understand the Sheikh. The Sheikh meant this, not that." I want to hear from these people. We want to hear from these people because Whitmore has said that if we get enough, high-quality writing of this level, we'll publish another book. A book of disagreements and agreements with my book. Because I think it's important. Because luckily, I recently found a WhatsApp group called Spiritual Lessons, and it has a lot of followers of Fritjof Schuon. Either those who knew him or those who were following him later just through his books. But these people have gotten to the point where they don't consider him to be infallible. They're very much, he is very much their influence, and, his ideas are the ideas that are mostly discussed, although they've become much more Islamic in form than he was, which is one of the things that was provided after his death by Sayyid Hussein Nasr and also by Martin Lings, is just make it more Islamic, because he was pretty syncretistic. He used the Lakota Sioux Indian invocation of Wakantanka instead of the Muslim call to prayer, and that's getting pretty far into syncretism. So people, he's been made, his stream has been made more Muslim after his passing, but they don't take him as infallible. They take him as extremely valuable. So this is what we hope, because if he's made infallible, then his doctrines are sealed, and nothing can come from it. Whereas if you say, "Yeah, this is wonderful what he said, but on the other hand, what about this?" then we continue to learn, and the amazing wisdom that was pouring through Fritjof Schuon will be able to continue. I remember J.G. Bennett, the Gurdjieff follower. He had a great thing that he said. He says, when the master passes on, his followers divide into three groups. One group are the people who said, "Well, I'm glad the old goat has kicked the bucket. Now I can do whatever I want." The other group are the every word of the master, and also like his eyeglasses and his dentures under glass, So everything should be as it was at the moment, because his doctrines were perfect. But there's a third group, says Bennett, which are called the near heretics. And he said it's the near heretics that carry on the teaching of the master, that are willing to disagree and yet not willing to reject, the truth that came through this teaching. And that's where I hope we can get now. I hope we don't lose the great wisdom that came through Fritjof Schuon because we have denied ourselves the right to criticize. Because, that would be a great loss to everyone.
Now, you've criticized Schuon for being, I think the word is syncretistic.
Yeah.
And I don't know that we've defined that word well enough for our viewers.
Well, it's like spiritual eclecticism. You take a little bit from this religion, a little bit from that religion, and put it together. And actually, the religion that is probably the most syncretistic in known history was Manichaeism, which had elements from Zoroastrianism, Christianity, Buddhism, and that was a truly syncretistic religion, which means it all the other religions hated it because, it relativized them. And so they ultimately did away with it.
Yeah.
But actually, I wrote a letter to Schuon in Bloomington, Indiana once, and I said, because he published an article in, I think it was called The Quest. It was a magazine of the Theosophical Society. And I know that one of the great, René Guénon considered the Theosophists to be, a big part of the counter-initiation. And one of his first books was called The Theosophy, the History of a Pseudo-Religion. And so now here Schuon is publishing in a Theosophical Society magazine. So I wrote him and I said, well, what about this, And I asked him, what are you doing, is what you're doing syncretism? And he didn't write back with his signature, but I got a typed letter back, which apparently was dictated to a secretary or something like that. And he said, what we are doing here is syncretism of a kind, but not the syncretism of the Theosophical Society. So that was the answer, which I take as coming from him. So if so, then he copped to the fact they were doing that. Whereas what I got from everywhere else, and I don't know where I got it, I mean, all the traditionalists I knew, who were basically Sayyid Hossein Nasr, James Cutzinger, Rama Kumaraswamy, and Houston Smith, and the people associated with them, the whole idea was syncretism is disallowed. We don't do that. We hold to the orthodoxy of the discrete faiths. So that's another thing that was taught, and I thought I learned that from Schuon, and then I read it more carefully, or I listened to see what was going on. I said, where did I get that? That's what we all believe. So anyway, that's another one of the many contradictions that should be fruitful for dialogue.
Well, I'm delighted that we're having this dialogue. I don't consider myself a traditionalist by any means. I'm probably more secular than that, but I love these conversations with you, Charles. I hope that we have more of them. You'll be welcome back over and over again on New Thinking Aloud, as far as I'm concerned.
Well, great. I mean, the other... Actually, I was looking through my writing. I accidentally sent you that book, Metaphysics for Hard Times, which I hope to get published soon. And I was looking in there. There are things that I've written about eschatology and about the life after death. Maybe I'll try to put those together and see if I actually have a theory that I don't realize that I have. What do I really believe about that?
Well, that would be a very interesting conversation. So I look forward to that and others with you, Charles. Okay. Thank you so much for being with me today.
Glad to be here, as always.
And for those of you listening or watching, thank you for being with us.